On the morning the thermometer stopped reading at -47 degrees, every cabin in the valley had smoke pouring from chimneys except one. Inside the curved metal structure half buried in the hillside, Thomas Brennan sat in shirt-sleeves, watching his neighbors burn through a week's worth of firewood in a single frozen night. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale might just change how you think about survival. On the morning the thermometer stopped reading at -47 degrees, every cabin in the valley had smoke pouring from chimneys except one. Inside the curved metal structure, half buried in the hillside, Thomas Brennan sat in shirt-sleeves, watching his neighbors burn through a week's worth of firewood in a single frozen night. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale might just change how you think about survival. The winter of 1952 arrived early in the Montana wilderness, and with it came the judgment Thomas had been expecting. He stood outside his nearly completed structure on a crisp October morning, hammer in hand, while three neighboring homesteaders approached on horseback. Their expressions told him everything he needed to know. Robert Hendricks dismounted first, a man in his 50s with weathered hands and the confidence of someone who had survived 20 Montana winters using methods passed down through generations. He walked slowly around Thomas's creation, shaking his head with each step. The structure looked like nothing the valley had ever seen. Half of it disappeared into the hillside itself, buried under tons of earth and sod. The visible portion curved upward like the back of some enormous metal whale, its corrugated steel surface catching the morning light in rippling patterns. "That's your solution?" Robert finally said, gesturing at the structure with undisguised contempt. "A curved tin can buried in the dirt?" The other two men laughed. James Worthy, younger but equally traditional, circled the building with exaggerated curiosity. "Looks like a root cellar someone tried to turn into a house, or maybe a bomb shelter. You expecting the Russians, Thomas?" "It's a Quonset hut." Thomas replied quietly, continuing to nail trim around the south-facing entrance, modified for permanent habitation. "The design has advantages you haven't considered." "Advantages?" Robert stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of experience that demanded respect. "Boy, I've built 4 cabins in this territory. Good log construction, proper chinked walls, steep roofs to shed snow. That's how you survive winter here, not by burying yourself alive in some military surplus contraption." Thomas set down his hammer and faced the three men directly. "Those log cabins are beautiful," he said, and he meant it. "But they bleed heat like open wounds. You'll burn 6 cords of wood this winter, keeping your families warm. I'll burn 1, maybe less." The statement hung in the cold air like a challenge. James Worthy actually laughed out loud. "1 cord through a Montana winter? You're either delusional or lying." "I'm neither," Thomas said. "The earth holds temperature. The curve sheds wind and snow. The thermal mass inside stores heat. It's simple physics." Robert mounted his horse, his judgment delivered. "Physics don't keep children warm at 40 below, Thomas. Wood does. Fire does. Solid walls do. You'll figure that out when this tin can turn into an icebox come December. Then you'll come begging to learn how real men build real cabins." Thomas watched the 3 men ride away, their laughter carrying across the valley until it faded into the wind. He didn't blame them for their skepticism. 4 years ago he would have laughed at himself too. 4 years ago he believed in traditional methods, in doing things the way they had always been done. Then the winter of 1948 taught him that tradition and survival weren't always the same thing. He had arrived in Montana that autumn with his wife Catherine, full of dreams and dangerous confidence. They had purchased 80 acres of valley land for almost nothing, built a cabin using every technique the old-timers recommended, and prepared for their first winter with the enthusiasm of people who had never truly understood cold. The cabin was beautiful. Thomas had spent 3 months selecting perfect logs, notching them with precision, chinking every gap with oakum and mud. He built a massive stone fireplace that he was certain would heat the entire structure. Catherine sewed thick curtains for the windows. They stacked 8 cords of firewood under a protective lean-to. Everything seemed ready. November arrived gently that year, with temperatures hovering around 20 degrees. The cabin performed adequately. The fireplace consumed wood steadily but manageably. Thomas congratulated himself on his craftsmanship. Then December came, and with it came temperatures that transformed the valley into something resembling the surface of another planet. The cold snap began on December 14th. Thomas woke that morning to find ice on the inside of their windows, crystalline patterns spreading across the glass like frozen ferns. The exterior thermometer read -28 degrees. He fed the fire aggressively, keeping flames roaring in the fireplace from dawn until midnight. The cabin's interior temperature struggled to reach 55 degrees. Catherine wore every piece of clothing she owned, huddled near the fire with blankets wrapped around her shoulders. By December 16th, the temperature had dropped to -37. Thomas burned through half a cord of wood in a single day. The cabin couldn't hold heat. Every gap between petits logs, no matter how carefully chinked, leaked warmth into the void outside. The stone fireplace, which he had built with such pride, radiated heat primarily up the chimney rather than into the room. Cold air poured in through the floor, rising through invisible gaps in the construction. Thomas worked frantically, stuffing rags into cracks, hanging blankets over walls, feeding the fire until his eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. Catherine began showing signs of hypothermia on December 17th. Her speech slurred. Her movements became sluggish. She stopped shivering, which Thomas knew was a dangerous sign. He wrapped her in every blanket they owned and made a decision that probably saved her life. He saddled their horse in the darkness, loaded Catherine onto it, and rode 8 miles through -40-degree cold to Robert Hendricks's homestead. Robert took them in without questions or judgment. His cabin, older and more established than Thomas's, had multiple fireplaces and years of modifications that improved its heat retention. Catherine recovered slowly over the next 3 days, while the cold snap continued its assault on the valley. Thomas spent those days studying Robert's cabin obsessively, noting every detail, understanding that his beautiful construction had nearly killed his wife. They returned to their cabin on December 22nd to find frozen devastation. Water pipes had burst. Food stores were frozen solid. The interior temperature matched the exterior. Thomas had failed at the most fundamental task of frontier life, keeping his family warm. Catherine never said anything about it. She didn't have to. Thomas saw it in her eyes every time she looked at their cabin, the fear that never quite disappeared even after spring arrived. That fear became his obsession. There had to be a better way. Spring of 1951 arrived like a pardon, washing away snow and bringing temperatures that felt miraculous after the brutality of winter. Thomas had survived 2 more seasons in the valley, each winter teaching him new lessons about his cabin's inadequacies. He had made modifications, additional chinking, thicker curtains, a second small stove in the bedroom. These helped, but they didn't solve the fundamental problem. His cabin was a beautiful, well-crafted structure that couldn't efficiently retain heat. He burned enormous amounts of firewood, spent countless hours tending fires, and still struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures during severe cold. Catherine had grown quieter over those years. She never complained, but Thomas noticed how she tensed whenever the temperature dropped, how she checked their firewood supply obsessively, how she wore extra layers, even on mild days, as if preparing for inevitable cold. The trauma of that first winter lived in her body, and Thomas carried the guilt of putting it there. In early May, Thomas made a supply run to Great Falls. A 3-day journey by wagon. The town had grown significantly since the war ended, swollen with returning soldiers and new businesses catering to the post-war boom. Thomas needed basic supplies: nails, flour, salt, lamp oil. But what he found in Great Falls changed everything. The military surplus yard occupied 5 acres on the eastern edge of town, filled with equipment the government no longer needed. Thomas had heard about these yards, places where wartime materials went to die or be repurposed. He wandered through out of curiosity, passing rows of jeeps, stacks of tires, crates of tools, still wrapped in protective grease. Then he saw them, 6 Quonset huts, standing in a neat line like enormous steel ribs reaching toward the sky. Thomas had seen these structures before in photographs from the war. The military used them for temporary housing, storage, workshops. They were simple, curved buildings, half-cylinder shapes made from corrugated steel designed to be assembled quickly and withstand harsh conditions. He had never considered them as anything other than utilitarian military equipment. But standing there in the May sunshine, looking at those curved steel frames, something clicked in his mind. He approached the yard manager, a gruff man named Vernon who had probably sold half the surplus in Montana. "Those Quonset huts," Thomas said, pointing. "What are you asking for them?" Vernon squinted at the structures. $40 each. That includes the frame, panels, doors, everything. You assemble it yourself. Most folks buy them for storage sheds or equipment barns. Do you have any documentation, engineering specifications, performance data? Vernon looked surprised by the question, but disappeared into his office, returning with a thick folder of military documents. Thomas spent the next 2 hours reading through technical specifications, cold weather performance reports, structural load calculations. The information fascinated him. The curved design distributed snow load efficiently, preventing the accumulation that could collapse flat roofs. The corrugated steel, while thin, had surprising strength due to its shape. Wind passed over the curved surface with minimal resistance. In military cold weather tests, the structures had performed remarkably well in Arctic conditions. But what really captured Thomas's attention was a side note in one report about earth-sheltered installations. Some military engineers had experimented with partially burying Quonset huts for improved insulation and camouflage. The earth-sheltered versions maintained more stable interior temperatures with significantly reduced heating requirements. The report was brief, just 2 paragraphs, but those paragraphs contained the seed of an idea that would consume Thomas for the next year. He bought 2 Quonset huts that afternoon, spending nearly all the money he had saved for supplies. Vernon helped him load the disassembled pieces onto his wagon, probably thinking Thomas was slightly insane for spending that much on what most people considered glorified storage sheds. Thomas returned to the valley with his wagon loaded with curved steel panels and a mind racing with possibilities. Catherine met him at their cabin, expecting to see supplies. Instead, she found her husband grinning like a man possessed, surrounded by what looked like pieces of a giant puzzle made from corrugated metal. "What is all this?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Our new home," Thomas replied, already sketching designs in the dirt with a stick, or rather the frame of it. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas developed his plan with obsessive attention to detail. He wasn't simply going to erect a Quonset hut and call it a home. He was going to create something unprecedented, a hybrid structure that combined military engineering with principles of earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass, and passive solar design. His neighbors thought he was building a house. Thomas knew he was engineering a survival system. The location came first. Thomas selected a south-facing hillside half a mile from their current cabin, a spot where the natural slope would allow him to excavate into the earth itself. The southern exposure was critical. Winter sun, though weak, would enter through south-facing windows and warm the interior. The hillside would provide protection from northern winds that brought the worst cold. His design was radical. He would excavate roughly 8 feet into the hillside, creating a space 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep. The back and side walls would be earth itself, held back by stone retaining walls he would build by hand. The Quonset frame would arch over this excavated space, creating a curved roof that would shed snow and wind. Then, and this was the part that seemed insane even to Thomas, he would bury the entire curved roof under 2 feet of earth and sod. The front facade, the only part fully exposed to air, would be constructed from logs to provide a traditional appearance and additional insulation. Large south-facing windows, triple-paned units he had spotted in the military surplus yard, would allow passive solar heating. Behind the wood stove, he planned to build a massive stone wall, perhaps 8 feet wide and floor-to-ceiling tall, using river stones as thermal mass. This wall would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly throughout the night. Catherine watched him sketch and calculate, her skepticism obvious but unspoken. "How long will this take to build?" she finally asked. "All summer? Maybe into fall. And you're certain it will work?" Thomas looked at his wife, seeing the fear that still lived in her eyes from that first winter. "I'm not certain of anything," he admitted. "But I know our current cabin nearly killed you. I know I burn 6 cords of wood every winter and still can't keep you warm. I know there has to be a better way, and every calculation I've done says this design should work." "Should work," Catherine repeated quietly. "The Earth maintains temperature," Thomas explained, pointing to his sketches. 55 degrees year-round, once you get deep enough. The Quonset frame is engineered for extreme conditions. The thermal mass will store heat. The southern exposure will capture solar gain. Catherine, this isn't guesswork, it's physics." She studied his drawings for a long moment, then met his eyes. "Then we should start digging." Thomas began excavation in early June. The work was brutal. 8 feet into a hillside, 30 feet wide, 40 feet deep. He calculated roughly 960 cubic feet of earth needed removal. Working alone with a shovel, wheelbarrow, and determination fueled by remembered trauma, he moved earth from dawn until dark. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back screamed in protest. His dog Max sat nearby, watching with patient incomprehension as Thomas waged war against the hillside itself. By late June, Thomas had excavated the basic cavity into the hillside. The back wall descended 8 feet into earth that smelled ancient and cold. The side walls angled slightly, following the natural contours of the slope. Standing at the bottom of his excavation felt like standing in a grave designed for something much larger than human. Catherine visited the site once during this phase, looked down into the hole and said nothing. Her expression spoke volumes. The next challenge was drainage. Water was earth-sheltered construction's primary enemy. Thomas knew that moisture seeping through soil would find its way to his structure, potentially causing catastrophic problems. He spent 2 weeks creating a drainage system that would redirect water around and away from his home. He dug trenches below the floor level, filled them with river gravel, and installed clay pipes he had purchased in Great Falls. The pipes would channel water downhill, away from the structure. He sloped the excavated floor slightly toward these drains, ensuring water would always flow away rather than pooling. The retaining walls came next. Thomas gathered stones from the creek bed, selecting flat pieces that would stack efficiently. He mixed mortar using sand, lime, and cement, working in small batches because mortar dried quickly in summer heat. The walls rose slowly, one stone at a time, each piece carefully selected and positioned. He built them thick, 18 inches at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. These walls would hold back tons of earth, and failure wasn't an option. By mid-July, the retaining walls were complete, and Thomas was ready to erect the Quonset frame. This was the moment he had been working toward, the point where his excavated hole would begin transforming into something recognizable as a structure. He had spent evenings studying the military assembly instructions, memorizing every step. The frame consisted of steel arches that connected to form the characteristic half-cylinder shape. Each arch weighed approximately 70 pounds and required careful positioning. Thomas worked alone, using a system of ropes and leverage to raise each arch into position. He would maneuver an arch to the edge of his excavation, secure it with temporary supports, then descend into the hole and pull it into final position using rope and pulley systems he had rigged from nearby trees. The work was dangerous and exhausting. One arch slipped during installation, nearly crushing his leg before he managed to redirect its fall. Max barked frantically during the incident, the only sound in the isolated valley beyond Thomas's own cursing and the crash of steel against stone. The frame took 3 weeks to complete. 12 arches, each precisely spaced and bolted together, creating a tunnel of steel that emerged from the hillside like the ribcage of some enormous beast. Thomas stepped back and surveyed his work. The curved structure looked alien against the natural landscape, completely unlike anything else in the valley. He understood why his neighbors mocked it. It looked insane. But Thomas wasn't building for aesthetics. He was building for physics. The next phase involved attaching corrugated steel panels to the frame. These panels, each one 4 feet wide and 12 feet long, would form the weatherproof skin of the structure. Thomas had painted them with rust-resistant coating before installation, knowing that moisture and steel were enemies. He bolted the panels to the frame, overlapping them like scales to shed water. The work required precision. Improperly installed panels would leak, or worse, create weak points where snow load could cause failure. August arrived with heat that made the metal panels almost too hot to touch. Thomas worked early mornings and late evenings, avoiding midday sun that turned his construction site into an oven. The panels went up steadily, row by row, until the entire Quonset frame was enclosed in its steel skin. Standing inside the structure now felt different. The curved ceiling rose above him, and though gaps still existed where the steel met earth, he could imagine the finished space. It felt larger than he expected, the curve creating a sense of openness that flat ceilings couldn't match. September arrived with cooler nights that reminded Thomas winter was approaching faster than his construction schedule preferred. He had enclosed the Quonset frame and begun the critical interior work, but the most important element remained unbuilt, the thermal mass wall that would make or break his entire heating strategy. Thomas had spent months researching thermal mass principles, reading every engineering document he could find in the Great Falls Library. The concept was elegantly simple. Dense materials like stone or water absorbed heat slowly when exposed to warmth, then released that heat gradually over many hours. A properly designed thermal mass system could capture heat from a wood stove or passive solar gain during the day and release it throughout the night, dramatically reducing fuel requirements and stabilizing interior temperatures. His design called for a massive stone wall positioned directly behind where his wood stove would sit. The wall would be 8 feet wide, extending floor to ceiling, and 20 inches thick. He calculated it would contain approximately 3,000 pounds of stone, enough mass to store significant thermal energy. The positioning was critical. Heat from the stove would strike the wall directly, absorbed by the stone. As the fire died down overnight, the wall would radiate stored warmth back into the living space. Thomas spent 2 weeks gathering stones from the creek bed, selecting pieces based on size and density. He wanted stones that weighed between 10 and 30 pounds each, large enough to provide mass, but small enough to handle and position precisely. He loaded them into his wagon, made countless trips from creek to construction site, and built a stockpile that resembled a cairn. Built by giants, the mortar mixture required careful formulation. Too much sand and the mortar would be weak. Too much cement and it would be brittle. Thomas experimented with ratios, creating test batches and examining how they cured. He settled on a mixture that used 3 parts sand to 1 part cement, with lime added for workability. The mortar needed to be strong enough to hold thousands of pounds of stone, yet porous enough to allow the thermal mass to function properly. He began building the wall on September 7th, starting with a foundation course of the largest stones. Each stone was cleaned, positioned carefully, and bedded in mortar. Thomas worked with the patience of someone who understood that rushing would create weakness. He checked one level constantly, ensuring the wall rose true and plumb. Catherine brought him lunch at the site, watching as her husband placed stone after stone with meticulous attention. "It's beautiful," she said, surprising him. Thomas looked at the wall, seeing only utility and physics. "It's functional." "It's both," Catherine replied. "You're not just building a house, Thomas. You're building something worth looking at." The wall rose inch by inch, course by course. Thomas's hands became intimately familiar with mortar and stone, developing an instinct for which stone would fit where, how much mortar would fill each gap, what angle would create the strongest bond. By mid-September, the wall reached waist height. By late September, it touched the ceiling. The completed structure dominated the interior space, a testament to both mass and craftsmanship. But appearance wasn't the point. Function was. Thomas installed his wood stove 18 inches in front of the stone wall, creating an air gap that would allow heat to circulate behind the stove and warm the entire wall surface. He had purchased a high-efficiency model from Great Falls, a newer design that burned wood more completely and radiated heat in multiple directions rather than just forward. The next innovation involved the stove's heat shield. Rather than using sheet metal as most installations did, Thomas created a heat shield from thinner stones suspended on an iron frame between the stove and the wall. This shield would protect the wall from direct flame while still allowing radiant heat to warm the thermal mass. The system was complex, requiring precise spacing and careful installation, but Thomas believed it would dramatically improve heat transfer efficiency. The first cold snap arrived on September 23rd, earlier than Thomas had hoped, but not unexpected. The temperature dropped to 32 degrees overnight, and frost painted the valley in crystalline white. Thomas had moved enough supplies into the Quonset structure to camp there, though the interior remained unfinished in many ways. Furniture consisted of a simple cot, a small table, and 2 chairs. The floor was still bare earth, though Thomas had plans for flagstone paving. But the essential systems were functional: the stove, the thermal mass wall, the insulated envelope. He lit his first fire in the new structure at dawn. Dry pine kindling caught quickly, and within minutes, flames danced in the firebox. Thomas fed larger pieces of wood gradually, building heat without overwhelming the new system. He wanted to observe how the structure responded, to understand its thermal behavior before winter's serious cold arrived. Catherine joined him an hour after sunrise, carrying coffee and breakfast. They sat together on the cot, watching the fire and monitoring the interior temperature with a thermometer Thomas had hung on the wall opposite the stove. The reading climbed slowly: 45 degrees at dawn, 50 degrees by 8 o'clock, 55 degrees by 9:30. "It's warming," Catherine observed. "Too slowly," Thomas replied, frowning. "At this rate, we'd burn through wood constantly trying to reach comfortable temperatures." But then something interesting happened. Around 10 o'clock, the rate of temperature increase accelerated. The thermometer showed 58 degrees, then 60 degrees, then 63 degrees within the next hour. Thomas realized what was occurring. The thermal mass wall had spent the first few hours absorbing heat, acting like a thermal sponge. Now, approaching saturation, it was beginning to radiate heat back into the space. The room wasn't just being heated by the stove anymore, it was being heated by the entire wall. By noon, with outside temperature reaching 45 degrees, the interior measured 68 degrees. Thomas had let the fire die down to coals, adding only small pieces of wood occasionally to maintain minimal flame. The thermal mass wall radiated warmth like a sleeping giant, its surface warm to the touch. He placed his hand against the stone and felt heat stored in thousands of pounds of rock. "This is working," Catherine said quietly, and Thomas heard wonder in her voice. The real test came that night. Thomas allowed the fire to die completely at 8 o'clock, wanting to observe how long the thermal mass could maintain interior temperature without active heating. Outside, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Inside, at 8 o'clock, the thermometer read 67 degrees. Thomas and Catherine lay on the cot, wrapped in blankets more from habit than necessity, watching the thermometer like expectant parents monitoring a sleeping child. By 9 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to 65 degrees. By 10 o'clock, 63 degrees. The decline was gentle, far slower than Thomas had experienced in any traditionally constructed cabin. At midnight, Thomas woke and checked the thermometer by lamplight. 60 degrees. The fire had been out for 4 hours, and the interior remained comfortable. He touched the thermal mass wall in the darkness. It still radiated warmth, though less intensely than earlier. The earth-sheltered walls felt cool, but not cold. The structure was holding heat in a way that seemed almost miraculous after years of watching cabins bleed warmth into winter nights. By dawn, when outside temperature had dropped to 25 degrees, the interior measured 56 degrees. Thomas had maintained livable temperature throughout the night without tending a fire, without waking to add wood, without the constant vigilance that characterized every winter night in his old cabin. He lit the morning fire and watched the temperature climb again, faster this time because the thermal mass hadn't fully cooled. Within 2 hours, the interior reached 68 degrees. Thomas did calculations in his notebook, estimating fuel consumption. If these patterns held during serious cold, he would use perhaps 1/4 the firewood his old cabin required. Catherine emerged from under blankets and immediately noticed the warmth. "You did it," she said. "It's only September," Thomas cautioned. 30 degrees isn't 40 below. We won't know if this really works until January." But privately, watching his thermometer and feeling the radiant warmth from his thermal mass wall, Thomas allowed himself to hope. While Thomas finished his unconventional structure through October, the valley's other homesteaders prepared for winter, using methods proven across generations. Robert Hendricks represented the pinnacle of traditional frontier construction. His cabin, built 12 years earlier, was a masterpiece of log craftsmanship that other settlers studied and emulated. Robert's cabin measured 24 feet by 32 feet, constructed from massive ponderosa pine logs, averaging 16 inches in diameter. He had selected each log personally, rejecting any with excessive taper or rot. The corners used interlocking dovetail notches, a technique requiring skill and precision, but creating joints that actually tightened as the wood settled over time. The gaps between logs were chinked with oakum and sealed with a mixture of clay, lime, and horsehair that Robert mixed himself using a recipe his father had brought from Virginia. The roof rose at a steep pitch to shed snow, covered with hand-split cedar shakes that overlapped like fish scales. Inside, Robert had built 2 fireplaces, one massive stone structure in the main room and a smaller one in the bedroom. Both chimneys rose well above the roof line, drawing properly and minimizing smoke. The windows, though small by modern standards, were beautifully framed and fitted with real glass panes, a luxury on the frontier. Robert's cabin was warm by frontier standards. It was also staggeringly inefficient by any objective measure. The massive logs, while beautiful and substantial, provided minimal insulation. Wood, regardless of thickness, conducts heat far better than modern insulating materials. The gaps between logs, no matter how carefully chinked, opened and closed as the wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The windows, single-paned and drafty, bled heat continuously. The fireplaces, though impressive, sent most of their heat up the chimney rather than into the living space. Robert burned approximately 6 cords of wood each winter, keeping fires burning continuously from November through March. He rose 3 times each night to feed the fires, a routine so ingrained he barely woke fully during these nocturnal duties. His wife Sarah managed the daytime fires, maintaining temperature through constant attention and adjustment. It was exhausting, expensive in terms of fuel, and accepted as simply the cost of frontier living. James Worthy's cabin, though smaller, followed similar principles. He had built 2 years earlier using Robert's cabin as his model. James's structure measured 18 feet by 24 feet, adequate for himself and his young wife Emma, but cramped by any generous standard. He burned 4 cords of wood per winter and considered himself fortunate that his cabin's smaller. Size reduced fuel requirements. Both men took pride in their construction. These weren't hastily built shelters, but carefully crafted homes representing hundreds of hours of skilled labor. The logs were straight and true. The notches were precise. The roofs were sound. By every measure of traditional frontier craftsmanship, these were excellent cabins. But excellent craftsmanship didn't equal thermal efficiency. The reality, which neither man would articulate because it was simply accepted reality, was that their beautiful cabins struggled to maintain 60 degrees interior temperature when outside temperatures dropped below zero. At 20 below, the interior might reach 55 degrees with fires blazing. At 40 below, 50 degrees was optimistic. They dressed in layers indoors during deep winter. They hung blankets over windows at night. They banked fires carefully before bed and woke to cold mornings that required immediate fire building. They accepted frozen water buckets, frost on interior walls during the coldest nights, and the knowledge that stepping more than 10 feet from an active fire meant entering uncomfortably cold space. This was frontier life. This was how it had always been done. When Robert looked at Thomas's buried metal structure, he didn't see innovation. He saw someone rejecting proven methods for untested fantasy. Robert knew cold. He had survived it for 12 years using techniques passed down through generations. His father had lived this way. His grandfather had lived this way. The methods worked, and the idea that some newcomer with surplus military equipment could improve upon generations of accumulated wisdom struck Robert as somewhere between amusing and insulting. November arrived with weather that felt like a preliminary examination before winter's final test. The first week brought temperatures in the low 20s, cold enough to require heating, but mild by Montana standards. Thomas monitored his structure obsessively, recording temperatures 3 times daily in a notebook that grew thick with data. The patterns remained encouraging. Morning fires brought interior temperature to 68 or 70 degrees within 2 hours. The thermal mass wall stored heat throughout the day. Evening fires were brief, just enough to maintain comfort before bed. Overnight, the temperature dropped slowly, typically reaching the mid-50s by dawn. Fuel consumption remained dramatically lower than Thomas had experienced in his old cabin. He was burning approximately 1/8 of a cord per week, a rate that suggested he might complete winter having used less than 2 cords total. The math seemed almost impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. His woodpile, which would have been noticeably diminished by now in previous years, remained nearly untouched. On November 9th, Robert Hendricks rode past Thomas's structure on his way to check trap lines. Thomas was outside, splitting kindling, and waved. Robert reined in his horse, curiosity overcoming his earlier dismissal. "How's the tin can treating you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected complaints. "Comfortably," Thomas replied, "using very little wood." Robert dismounted and walked to the entrance, peering inside. Thomas had completed more finish work since September. The earth floor was now covered with flagstones fitted together like a puzzle. Simple furniture occupied the space. The thermal mass wall dominated one end, its stone face catching light from the windows. The curved ceiling rose overhead, creating unexpected spaciousness. "It's warmer than I expected," Robert admitted, standing just inside the doorway. "What's the temperature?" Thomas checked his thermometer. 64 degrees. The fire's been out for 3 hours. Robert frowned, clearly skeptical. "Outside is maybe 25. You're telling me this place holds 40 degrees of difference without active heating? The Earth insulates. The thermal mass radiates stored heat. The curved design minimizes heat loss. It's not magic, Robert. It's physics. Robert walked to the thermal mass wall and placed his hand against it. The stone was warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. He said nothing, but Thomas saw calculation in his eyes. Robert was a practical man who trusted evidence over theory. The warmth radiating from that wall was evidence that couldn't be dismissed. "November isn't January," Robert finally said. "We'll see how you fare when it's 40 below for a week straight." "We will," Thomas agreed. The warning came on November 20th. Thomas's radio, a battery-powered unit he kept for weather reports, crackled with news from the National Weather Service. A significant cold front was moving south from Canada, expected to arrive in 3 days. Predictions called for temperatures dropping to -20 or below, potentially lasting 5 to 7 days. It wasn't the apocalyptic cold of deep January, but it was serious enough to test every cabin in the valley. Thomas checked his preparations methodically. His woodpile held 6 cords of seasoned pine and fir, far more than he expected to need, but comforting to have available. The structure's gaps and potential air leaks had been sealed with additional insulation. The thermal mass wall was seasoned now, having gone through multiple heating and cooling cycles. Extra food supplies sat on shelves. Water containers were filled. He was ready. Catherine watched him prepare with an expression Thomas recognized. She was trying not to show fear, but the memory of 1948 lived close to the surface whenever serious cold approached. "We'll be fine," Thomas said quietly, taking her hand. "This structure is designed for exactly this kind of weather." "I know," Catherine replied, "but knowing and feeling are different things." On November 22nd, the temperature began dropping. By evening, it had reached 15 degrees. By midnight, 5 degrees. The cold front had arrived early, and weather reports now predicted even lower temperatures than initially forecast. -30 was possible. -35 wasn't out of the question. Thomas maintained his normal fire routine, refusing to panic or overcompensate. Evening fire at 6 o'clock, allowed to burn down to coals by 9 o'clock. The interior temperature at bedtime was 67 degrees. Outside was -2 degrees. He and Catherine went to bed with extra blankets, more from psychological comfort than necessity. Thomas woke at dawn on November 23rd to a silence that felt different from normal morning quiet. It was the stillness that comes when temperature drops so low that everything freezes into motionless waiting. He rose from bed, his breath not quite visible in the interior air, and walked to the door. The thermometer outside read -35 degrees. Inside, the thermometer showed 58 degrees, having dropped 19 degrees overnight without any fire. He lit the morning fire using kindling and progressively larger pieces of split pine. The wood caught quickly, flames dancing up through the carefully arranged fuel. Within 30 minutes, the interior temperature began climbing. By the time Catherine woke an hour later, the thermometer read 66 degrees and rising. Thomas had added only 3 small logs to the fire since lighting it. "How cold is it outside?" Catherine asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. -35. The radio says it might reach -40 today." Catherine pulled a shawl around her shoulders, more from habit than need. The interior felt comfortable, nothing like the desperate cold that had characterized their first Montana cabin during similar weather. She walked to the thermal mass wall and placed her palm against its surface. Warmth radiated into her hand. "It's working," she said quietly. "So far," Thomas replied, unwilling to celebrate. Prematurely. "We're only 1 night into this cold snap." By mid-morning, with the outside temperature holding at -37 degrees, the interior had reached 68 degrees. Thomas let the fire die back to minimal coals, feeding it only occasionally with small splits to maintain slight flame. The structure was performing exactly as his calculations had predicted. The earth-sheltered walls provided massive insulation. The thermal mass wall released stored heat continuously. The curved roof design minimized heat loss through what would have been attic space in a traditional cabin. Around noon, Thomas decided to check on his neighbors. He dressed in layers, covering every inch of exposed skin, and stepped outside into cold that felt like a physical assault. The air burned in his lungs. His exposed cheeks stung despite the wool scarf wrapped around his face. He walked the half-mile to Robert Hendricks's cabin, moving quickly to generate body heat. Smoke poured from both of Robert's chimneys, dense white columns rising straight up in the windless air. Thomas could hear the sound of someone splitting wood before he saw Robert at his woodpile, swinging an axe with methodical urgency. Robert looked up as Thomas approached, his face red from exertion and cold. "Temperature inside?" Thomas asked. 52 degrees with both fires roaring," Robert replied between axe swings. "Went through half a cord already today. At this rate, I'll burn 3 cords before this cold snap ends." Thomas did mental math. 3 cords was more wood than he would use all winter. "Your fires have been burning all night?" "Sarah fed them every 2 hours. I took over at dawn." Robert split another log with a sharp crack. "This is serious cold, Thomas. Not time for experimentation. You keeping warm in that metal can?" 68 degrees. Used maybe 3 logs this morning." Robert stopped mid-swing, the axe hanging at the top of its arc. 3 logs in 12 hours? "I let the fire die overnight. The thermal mass kept us comfortable." Robert lowered the axe slowly, studying Thomas's face for signs of exaggeration or dishonesty. He found neither. "Show me," he finally said. They walked back to Thomas's structure together, Robert leaving his desperate wood-splitting unfinished. When Robert stepped inside the Quonset hut, his expression transformed from skepticism to something approaching wonder. The interior was unmistakably warm, comfortable in a way his own cabin hadn't been in days. The fire in Thomas's stove was barely burning, just a few coals and 1 small log, yet the thermometer on the wall read 67 degrees. Robert walked slowly to the thermal mass wall and stood before it, hands extended toward its radiant warmth. "This shouldn't be possible," he said quietly. "It's possible because heat behaves according to predictable principles," Thomas replied. "Your cabin is beautiful, Robert, but it's essentially a wooden box sitting on frozen ground. Mine is an insulated envelope wrapped in the earth itself. Your cabin fights the cold. Mine ignores it." The second day of the cold snap brought temperatures that tested the limits of measurement. Thomas's exterior thermometer, rated to -50 degrees, showed -40 degrees at dawn. The radio reported that some valley locations had recorded -43. Wind chill, though minimal due to calm air, made any outdoor exposure dangerous within minutes. Exposed skin would develop frostbite in under 5 minutes. Prolonged exposure meant death. Thomas maintained his routine with slight modifications. He built morning fire slightly larger than usual, feeding it more frequently throughout the day. The interior temperature climbed to 69 degrees by mid-morning and held steady. He was burning approximately 1 log per hour during active heating, then allowing the fire to coast on thermal mass radiation during rest periods. Total fuel consumption for the day would amount to perhaps 1/6 of a cord, sustainable indefinitely given his wood supplies. Catherine had relaxed visibly over the past 36 hours. The fear that had lived in her body since 1948 was slowly being replaced by something Thomas recognized as trust. She moved through their space without the tense readiness that had characterized previous winters, without constantly checking the fire or monitoring the temperature. She was beginning to believe they were actually safe. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, they heard a knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find Robert Hendricks standing outside, his face showing the strain of 2 days battling extreme cold. Robert stepped inside quickly, and Thomas closed the door against the frigid air that had rushed in with him. "I need advice," Robert said without preamble. His pride had clearly taken a beating, but desperation overrode ego. "We're burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. At current consumption, I'll be out of fuel in 8 days. If this cold continues longer than that, my family will be in danger." Thomas gestured for Robert to sit. Catherine poured coffee from the pot that stayed warm on their stove. Robert wrapped his hands around the cup, savoring warmth that came effortlessly in Thomas's space, but required constant battle in his own. "Tell me about your cabin's construction," Thomas said. "Specifically, where do you think heat is escaping?" Robert described his structure in detail. The gaps between logs that expanded and contracted with temperature changes, the single-pane windows that frosted over inside, the fieldstone fireplace that drew air from inside the cabin and sent it up the chimney, the floor that sat directly on frozen ground with no insulation beneath. As he talked, Thomas listened carefully, identifying the thermal weaknesses that made Robert's cabin an energy catastrophe. "Your biggest problem is infiltration," Thomas said. "Cold air enters through gaps, displaces warm air, and gets sucked up your chimney. You're essentially heating the outdoors." "How do I stop it?" Thomas spent the next hour explaining modifications Robert could implement immediately. Hang blankets over windows at night to create dead air space. Stuff rags into any visible gaps between logs. Build a temporary insulated panel to place in front of the fireplace when not actively burning, reducing chimney draft. Most importantly, reduce fire intensity. Robert's instinct was to burn massive fires to combat cold, but this actually increased heat loss by creating stronger chimney draft that pulled warm air from the cabin. "Smaller, steadier fires," Thomas explained. "Let the structure stabilize at a lower temperature rather than creating huge temperature swings. You'll use less wood and maintain more consistent comfort." Robert listened with the attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding. "What about long-term solutions? If I rebuild next summer, what should I do differently?" Thomas pulled out his construction notebooks, filled with sketches and calculations. He walked Robert through the principles: earth sheltering for insulation, thermal mass for heat storage, reduced window area, better door seals, insulated floors. Robert studied the drawings like a man memorizing a map to safety. "This works," Robert said finally, gesturing at Thomas's structure. "I thought you were insane. I was wrong. This actually works." "It works because I learned from failure," Thomas replied. "My first cabin nearly killed Catherine. I couldn't let that happen again." Robert stood to leave, tucking Thomas's sketches into his coat. At the door he paused. "James Worthy is struggling too. Burned through 2 cords already. Can I share this information with him?" "Share it with anyone who needs it," Thomas said. "I'm not trying to keep secrets. I'm trying to keep people alive." After Robert left, Catherine sat quietly for a long moment. "He came here for help," she finally said. "The man who mocked your tin can came asking for help." "Pride breaks faster than ice in this kind of cold," Thomas replied. 2 more days of -40 will convince everyone that tradition isn't the same as wisdom. November 25th brought temperatures that seemed to defy natural law. Thomas woke at first light and checked his exterior thermometer, certain he was misreading the mercury. -47 degrees. He tapped the glass, wondering if the instrument had failed, but the reading remained steady. The radio confirmed what seemed impossible. The valley was experiencing the coldest November temperatures in recorded history. Several stations had stopped reading at -45. Thomas's thermometer, rated to -50, showed the full, brutal truth. Inside his structure, the temperature had dropped to 54 degrees overnight, the lowest reading since the cold snap began. Thomas built his morning fire with more substantial fuel, adding larger logs to generate heat that would recharge the thermal mass wall. Within 90 minutes, the interior climbed to 66 degrees. He settled into his routine, feeding the fire steadily but not frantically. trusting his system to perform. Around noon, the situation outside became desperate. Thomas heard what sounded like someone shouting in the distance. He grabbed his heavy coat and stepped outside into cold that felt like entering another dimension. The air physically hurt to breathe. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, tears freezing on his cheeks almost instantly. He heard the shouting again, closer now, and recognized James Worthy's voice. James appeared from the tree line, moving in an awkward, stumbling run. His face was bright red, his movements uncoordinated. Thomas recognized the signs of hypothermia immediately. He rushed forward, grabbed James's arm, and half-dragged him to the entrance. Once inside, James collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. Catherine was already moving, grabbing blankets and starting water heating on the stove. Thomas stripped off James's outer layers, which were crusted with frost from frozen breath and sweat. James's core temperature had dropped dangerously low. His speech was slurred, his movement sluggish. Another 30 minutes outside, and he might not have survived. "What happened?" Thomas asked, wrapping James in blankets near the thermal mass wall. "Ran out of wood," James managed through chattering teeth. "Burned everything. Cabin got too cold. Emma couldn't stop shaking. Thought maybe you had extra fuel. Walked here." Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances. James had walked half a mile in negative 47-degree weather without adequate clothing because he had burned through his entire winter wood supply in 3 days. His cabin, already cold when he left, would be approaching exterior temperature by now. His wife Emma was alone in a structure that offered no protection whatsoever. "Catherine, keep him warm," Thomas said, already pulling on extra layers. "I'm going to get Emma." "Thomas, no," Catherine said, fear sharp in her voice. "That temperature will kill you." "It'll definitely kill Emma if she stays in that cabin." Thomas wrapped a heavy scarf around his face, covering everything except his eyes. He grabbed a coil of rope from his supplies. "If I'm not back in 90 minutes, assume something went wrong." He stepped into the cold and immediately understood how close James had come to death. The temperature was beyond anything Thomas had experienced. Each breath felt like inhaling needles. His exposed skin around his eyes stung within seconds. He tied one end of the rope to a tree near his entrance and began walking toward James's cabin, playing out rope behind him. If visibility dropped or he became disoriented, the rope would guide him back. The half-mile journey felt like miles. Thomas forced himself to maintain steady pace, not too fast to exhaust. Himself not too slow to extend exposure to. He counted steps to track distance, focusing on the mechanical act of walking rather than the cold penetrating every layer of clothing. His feet became numb, his hands ached despite thick gloves. He could feel his core temperature dropping. James's cabin appeared through sparse trees, its chimney smokeless and lifeless. Thomas reached the door and pushed inside. The interior was barely warmer than outside, perhaps 10 degrees at most. Emma huddled in the corner, wrapped in every blanket they owned, shaking uncontrollably. She looked up as Thomas entered, her face showing the dull confusion of advanced hypothermia. "We're leaving," Thomas said, his words muffled by the scarf over his face. He didn't explain or argue. He wrapped Emma in another layer from his own coat, lifted her bodily, and carried her out into the killing cold. She was small, perhaps 100 pounds, but carrying her weight made the return journey exponentially harder. Thomas carried Emma back to his structure following the rope line he had laid, each step requiring conscious decision and effort. His muscles screamed in protest. His lungs burned from breathing air that felt more like frozen acid than oxygen. Emma had stopped shaking, which Thomas knew was a dire sign. Her body had progressed beyond the shivering stage of hypothermia into a state where core systems were shutting down to preserve vital organs. The journey that had taken 12 minutes outbound required 23 minutes returning. When Thomas finally pushed through his door, carrying Emma's limp form, he was shaking himself from exertion and cold exposure. Catherine had prepared everything. Blankets were piled near the thermal mass wall. Hot water steamed in pots on the stove. James, recovered enough to function, helped Thomas lay Emma near the radiant heat of the stone wall. They worked methodically, following the protocols for severe hypothermia Thomas had read about in Survival. Manuals: remove wet clothing carefully, wrap in dry blankets. Apply heat gradually to the core, not the extremities. Give warm fluids only after shivering resumed, indicating the body was attempting to generate its own heat again. For 45 minutes, Emma lay motionless, except for shallow breathing, while the warmth of Thomas's structure slowly penetrated her dangerously cooled body. Then she began shaking violently, her body's core temperature rising enough to trigger the shivering reflex. Thomas and Catherine surrounded her with additional blankets, maintaining the careful warming process. After 90 minutes, Emma was conscious enough to sip hot broth. After 2 hours, she could speak coherently. After 3 hours, she was crying with relief and residual fear from how close she had come to freezing to death in her own home. "Your cabin saved our lives," James said to Thomas, his voice carrying weight that went beyond simple gratitude. "We would have died today, both of us, because I was too stubborn and too stupid to prepare properly." "You prepared the way everyone prepares," Thomas replied. "The problem isn't your effort. It's that traditional methods don't work efficiently in extreme conditions." By mid-afternoon, word had spread through the valley's scattered community that Thomas was sheltering the Worthies. Other families, struggling desperately with the sustained extreme cold, began arriving. First came Robert Hendricks with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, aged 7 and 9. Robert's cabin, despite his modifications based on Thomas's advice, couldn't maintain livable temperature in negative 47-degree cold while conserving fuel. He had made a calculation that his family's safety mattered more than his pride. Then came the Johnsons, an older couple whose small cabin had developed a crack in the chimney that made fire unsafe. They had been without heat for 18 hours, surviving by huddling under blankets and praying for dawn. Then the Carmichaels arrived with their infant daughter, terrified that the baby couldn't survive another night in their inadequately insulated structure. By evening, Thomas's Quonset hut sheltered 14 people: himself, Catherine, the Worthies, the Hendricks family, the Johnsons, and the Carmichaels. The space that had seemed vast for 2 people became crowded with bodies, belongings, and desperation. But it also became something else, proof of concept on a scale Thomas hadn't imagined. He built up the fire to accommodate the additional bodies and heat loss from people entering and exiting. The thermal mass wall radiated heat continuously. The earth-shelter design maintained its insulating properties. The interior temperature held at 65 degrees despite 14 occupants, frequent door openings, and exterior temperatures that had killed the pioneers poorly prepared for Montana's worst. The children, released from the tension and fear of their own cold homes, began to play in the curved space. Their laughter seemed strange after days of grim survival, but it reminded everyone what they were fighting for. Sarah Hendricks stood beside Thomas, watching her children run beneath the curved ceiling. "You built this for Catherine," Sarah said quietly, "after your first winter nearly killed her." "I built it because I couldn't live with that fear anymore," Thomas replied. "The fear of failing to protect her." "You didn't just protect her," Sarah said, gesturing at the families crowded into the warm space. "You protected all of us, even when we mocked you for trying." The 5th day of the cold snap, November 26th, brought the first sign that nature's assault was weakening. Thomas woke to find the exterior thermometer reading negative 38 degrees, still brutally cold, but 9 degrees warmer than the previous day's low. The radio confirmed that the Arctic air mass was beginning to retreat northward. Temperatures would moderate over the next 48 hours, potentially reaching negative 20 by the following evening and climbing above zero within 3 days. The families sheltering in Thomas's structure greeted this news with relief that bordered on euphoria. They had survived the worst November cold in recorded history, an event that would have killed some or all of them without the refuge Thomas had built. As morning progressed and temperature continued its slow climb to -33, then -30, families began preparing to return to their own cabins. Robert Hendricks was first to leave, needing to assess damage and restart his fires before his cabin's interior froze solid. He paused at the door, facing Thomas directly. "Next summer," he said, "I'm rebuilding. I'm using your principles. Will you help me?" "I'll help anyone who wants to build something better," Thomas replied. James Worthy lingered longer, helping Thomas restock firewood from the outdoor pile. His cabin had gone unheated for nearly 2 full days. He expected to find frozen pipes, damaged food stores, possibly worse, but he was alive, and so was Emma, and that made everything else manageable. Before leaving, James shook Thomas's hand with both of his own. "I called your design a tin can," James said. "I laughed at you. I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize for skepticism," Thomas replied. "You need to apply what you learned, build better, prepare smarter, survive longer." By afternoon, only Thomas and Catherine remained in the structure. The sudden emptiness felt strange after days of crowded occupation. Catherine moved through the space, straightening blankets, cleaning up the minor chaos that 14 people inevitably created. Thomas sat at his small table, reviewing his temperature logs from the 5-day cold snap. The data told a clear story. His structure had maintained interior temperatures between 54 and 69 degrees, while exterior temperatures ranged from -33 to -47 degrees. Total fuel consumption over 5 days amounted to approximately 1 cord of wood, burned primarily during the coldest period when he was heating for 14 people rather than 2. Under normal occupation, he estimated he would have used 1/4 cord. By comparison, Robert Hendricks had burned nearly 4 cords in 5 days, and his cabin had barely maintained 50 degrees. James Worthy had exhausted his entire supply in 3 days and nearly killed himself and his wife in the process. Traditional construction, for all its beauty and craftsmanship, had failed catastrophically when tested by truly extreme conditions. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked, sitting across from him. "I'm thinking that building this structure was the right decision," Thomas replied. "Not just for us, for everyone who saw it work. They'll want to learn from you now. They already do. Robert's rebuilding next summer. James will too, probably. Others will follow. This valley is going to look different in 5 years." Catherine reached across the table and took his hand. "You know what matters most to me? Not that you proved them wrong, not that your design worked perfectly. What matters is that when people needed help, you gave it without hesitation. You could have turned them away, let them freeze, told them they should have listened when you tried to explain, but you didn't. You opened your door." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "The structure doesn't mean anything if the person inside it isn't worth saving, or isn't willing to save others." That evening, with exterior temperature climbing to -20, Thomas built a small fire more for comfort than necessity. He and Catherine sat together near the thermal mass wall, feeling its radiant warmth and watching flames dance in the stove. The crisis had passed. The cold would moderate. Winter would continue in less extreme form, but something fundamental had changed in the valley. People had seen proof that innovation could save lives, that questioning tradition was sometimes necessary, and that sharing knowledge mattered more than protecting pride. Winter released its grip on the valley in early March, temperatures climbing above freezing during daylight hours and melting the snow that had accumulated over 5 months of cold. Thomas had completed his first full winter in the earth-sheltered Quonset structure, and the final accounting validated everything his calculations had predicted. Total fuel consumption, 1 3/4 cords of wood. His old cabin would have required 7 cords minimum for comparable comfort. The structure had performed flawlessly through temperature extremes ranging from -47 degrees to the relative warmth of March. Catherine had transformed over that winter. The fear that had lived in her body since 1948 had finally begun to release. She moved through their space with confidence, no longer startling at facade temperature drops or checking firewood supplies obsessively. She had learned to trust the structure, and more importantly, to trust that Thomas's obsessive attention to engineering had created genuine safety rather than theoretical possibility. As snowmelt turned trails into muddy channels and the first green shoots appeared in protected areas, the valley's homesteaders began their annual spring activities, checking fence lines, assessing winter damage, planning summer work. But this spring carried a different energy than previous years. 3 families had already approached Thomas about consulting on major reconstruction projects. What had seemed like an isolated experiment the previous summer had become a movement. Robert Hendricks arrived on a mild April morning, bringing detailed sketches of his planned rebuild. He had spent the winter thinking, calculating, learning from his cabin's failures. His design incorporated many of Thomas's principles, but adapted them to his specific site and needs. Rather than a full Quonset structure, Robert planned a hybrid, traditional log construction for the front half, earth-sheltered walls on 3 sides, a thermal mass wall behind his stove, and a heavily insulated roof system. "I can't abandon log work entirely," Robert explained, spreading his drawings on Thomas's table. "It's what I know, what I'm good at. But I'm incorporating your principles where they matter most: thermal envelope, mass for heat storage, earth insulation." Thomas studied the sketches carefully, noting strengths and potential weaknesses. "Your south wall is all logs with large windows. That's your thermal weak point. Consider reducing window area and adding shutters that close at night to create dead air space." "Like storm windows?" "Exactly. Wood shutters hinged to close over the windows after dark. Opens up during day for light and solar gain, closes at night to dramatically reduce heat loss." They spent 3 hours reviewing Robert's plans, with Thomas suggesting modifications based on principles he had learned through his own construction and winter testing. Robert took notes constantly, asking detailed questions about materials, techniques, thermal properties. The man who had mocked Thomas's tin can 8 months earlier now sought his guidance with genuine humility. James Worthy came the following week with similar requests. His rebuild would be more radical than Robert's, incorporating a partially buried design similar to Thomas's, but using a conventional peaked roof instead of the Quonset curve. He had located a hillside site that would allow 3 walls to benefit from earth sheltering while maintaining southern exposure for passive solar gain. "Will the peaked roof work as well as your curve?" James asked. "The curve is more efficient for snow load and structural strength," Thomas replied. "But a well-insulated peaked roof with proper ventilation will function adequately. The key is preventing heat loss through the roof assembly, not the roof shape itself." By mid-April, Thomas found himself consulting on 5 different building projects across the valley. He charged nothing for his advice, considering the knowledge sharing a form of community investment. If people built better structures, everyone benefited. The valley would be safer, more resilient, less vulnerable to extreme weather events. The Johnsons, the elderly couple whose cracked chimney had forced them to seek shelter during the November cold snap, approached with a different request. They were too old to undertake major construction, but wanted to retrofit their existing cabin with improvements that would make it more efficient. Thomas helped them install a small thermal mass wall, improve their chinking, add insulated shutters to their windows, and redesign their fireplace to reduce chimney draft while improving heat radiation. The work took 2 weeks, with Thomas donating labor and the Johnsons providing meals and gratitude. When finished, their cabin wouldn't match Thomas's efficiency, but it would be dramatically better than before. Mrs. Johnson cried when she felt the warmth radiating from their new thermal mass wall, remembering the 18 hours they had spent without heat the previous November, certain they would freeze to death in their own home. "You saved our lives twice," she told Thomas. "Once by sheltering us, once by teaching us how to shelter ourselves." Summer brought construction activity unprecedented in the valley's history. What had been a scattered community of isolated homesteaders became a collaborative network of builders learning and implementing new techniques. Robert Hendrick's reconstruction drew visitors from neighboring valleys who had heard about the new method of building that had kept people alive during the record November cold snap. Thomas found himself explaining principles repeatedly. Earth sheltering provides consistent insulation regardless of exterior temperature. Thermal mass stores heat during warm periods and releases it during cold periods, stabilizing interior temperature. Reducing air infiltration matters more than increasing active heating. Small, steady fires outperform large, irregular fires. Southern exposure captures passive solar gain even in winter. The concepts weren't complicated, but they contradicted generations of accepted practice. Some visitors remained skeptical. A homesteader named William Cross listened to Thomas's explanation of thermal mass, shook his head, and said, "My father built log cabins for 40 years without needing buried walls and rock piles. If traditional methods were good enough for him, they're good enough for me." Thomas didn't argue. He had learned that some people would only believe evidence they discovered personally, and no amount of explanation would substitute for lived experience. But others embraced the new approaches with enthusiasm that surprised Thomas. A young couple named Daniel and Ruth Martinez had just arrived in Montana, planning to homestead on land they had purchased sight unseen. They attended a community gathering where Thomas explained his design principles and immediately altered their plans. Instead of building a traditional cabin as originally intended, they worked with Thomas to design an earth-sheltered structure customized to their specific site. The Martinez build became a teaching opportunity. Thomas invited anyone interested to observe and participate, turning their construction into an informal workshop. 8 people showed up the first day. 12 came the second day. By the end of the first week, the Martinez site had become a gathering place where homesteaders shared techniques, solved problems collaboratively, and learned that innovation didn't require formal education or expensive materials. It required attention, effort, and willingness to question assumptions. Robert Hendricks completed his hybrid cabin in late July. The structure combined traditional craftsmanship with modern principles beautifully. The log facade looked familiar and comfortable, satisfying Robert's aesthetic preferences and his identity as a log builder. But behind that traditional appearance lived engineering that would have been unrecognizable to frontier builders from previous generations. Earth-sheltered walls, thermal mass, superior insulation, and careful attention to thermal envelope created a structure that looked traditional but performed revolutionary. Robert's first test came in early August when a brief cold snap dropped temperatures to 35 degrees overnight. He lit his evening fire, maintained it for 2 hours, then let it die completely. The next morning, his interior temperature had dropped only 6 degrees, from 68 to 62. He walked to Thomas's structure with a bottle of whiskey and a smile that conveyed more than words. "It works," Robert said simply, setting the bottle on Thomas's table. "Everything you said would happen is happening. I'm a believer." By autumn, 7 structures in the valley had been built or extensively modified using principles Thomas had developed. Word spread beyond the immediate community. Agricultural extension agents from the state university visited to document the techniques. A journalist from a regional homesteading magazine spent 3 days interviewing Thomas and photographing the various structures, planning an article about the Montana thermal revolution. Thomas found the attention simultaneously flattering and uncomfortable. He hadn't set out to revolutionize frontier construction. He had simply tried to solve a personal problem, keeping his wife safe during winter. The fact that his solution had broader application was almost accidental, though he recognized its significance. The magazine article appeared in November, titled "Earth-Sheltered Homesteading: One Man's Innovation Saves Lives and Transforms Community." The piece featured detailed photographs of Thomas's Quonset structure, technical drawings of key principles, and testimonials from Valley residents whose lives had been changed by adopting new building methods. The article ended with a paragraph that Thomas read multiple times. Thomas Brennan didn't discover new physics or invent new materials. He simply applied existing knowledge with exceptional care and shared his discoveries freely. In doing so, he demonstrated that frontier innovation often comes not from individual genius, but from community willingness to learn, adapt, and support one another's survival. The magazine article reached audiences far beyond Montana. Over the following 18 months, Thomas received letters from homesteaders across the northern United States and Canada asking questions about earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass principles, and specific technical details. He answered every letter personally, often including hand-drawn sketches and detailed calculations. Catherine helped with correspondence, organizing letters by topic, and maintaining files of common questions and standardized responses. By the spring of 1954, the movement that began with Thomas's single experimental structure had spread across 3 states. Agricultural extension offices began teaching earth-sheltered construction techniques in their homesteading programs. Lumber yards started stocking materials specifically for thermal mass walls and improved insulation systems. Surplus Quonset huts, previously considered suitable only for storage, were purchased specifically for conversion into efficient residential structures. The Montana State University College of Agriculture sent a professor named Dr. Harold Fisher to study the valley's earth-sheltered structures systematically. Dr. Fisher spent 2 weeks measuring temperature differentials, calculating thermal efficiency, and interviewing residents about fuel consumption and comfort levels. His subsequent research paper, published in the Journal of Cold Climate Housing, provided academic validation for what Thomas had developed through practical experimentation. Your thermal efficiency exceeds commercial construction by factors of 3 to 5, Dr. Fisher told Thomas during his final visit. These structures would be considered innovative even with modern materials and professional engineering support. The fact that you developed them using surplus materials and basic carpentry tools is remarkable. Thomas appreciated the validation, but remained focused on practical outcomes rather than academic recognition. What mattered to him was that families across the northern frontier were warmer, safer, and more secure because they had adopted better building methods. The number of lives potentially saved was incalculable, but undoubtedly significant. By 1956, the valley had become a destination for people interested in cold climate construction. Visitors arrived regularly during summer months, touring the various earth-sheltered structures and learning directly from the homesteaders who lived in them. Robert Hendricks, once Thomas's harshest critic, had become one of the technique's most articulate advocates. He gave tours of his hybrid cabin, explaining how traditional log craftsmanship could be enhanced rather than replaced by modern thermal principles. The transformation extended beyond individual structures to community resilience. During the winter of 1955 to 56, another severe cold snap brought temperatures to -42 degrees for 3 consecutive days. The event would have caused crisis and potential tragedy 5 years earlier. Instead, the valley weathered the cold with minimal difficulty. No families ran out of fuel, no one sought emergency shelter, no one experienced hypothermia or frostbite. The improved structures had created genuine safety rather than merely adequate shelter. Thomas and Catherine's lives had also transformed. Their earth-sheltered Quonset, initially built as a desperate solution to a personal survival problem, had become a symbol of what was possible when people questioned tradition constructively. Visitors from across the country stopped to see the structure that had started everything, to meet the man who had built it, and to learn that innovation didn't require genius, just willingness to think carefully about problems and apply solutions systematically. In 1958, Thomas was invited to speak at the National Homesteaders Conference in Denver. He initially declined, uncomfortable with public speaking and formal presentations. But Catherine encouraged him, arguing that sharing knowledge on a larger scale could save even more lives. Thomas finally agreed, though he insisted on keeping his presentation practical rather than theoretical. His talk, titled Earth-Sheltered Construction for Extreme Climates, Practical Techniques from Montana, drew the largest audience of the conference. Thomas spoke for 45 minutes, showing photographs, explaining principles, and answering questions. He emphasized that his techniques weren't proprietary or complex. Anyone with basic carpentry skills and willingness to work carefully could build structures dramatically more efficient than traditional frontier cabins. The response overwhelmed him. Dozens of people approached afterward, asking for advice on specific projects, requesting copies of his drawings, wanting to know if he would consult on their construction plans. Thomas agreed to everything, refusing payment, insisting that knowledge should be freely shared because survival wasn't something to profit from. Thomas Brennan was 78 years old when his grandchildren visited the earth-sheltered Quonset during Christmas of 2004. The structure, now 52 years old, remained as solid and efficient as the day he completed it. The corrugated steel showed weathering, but no structural failure. The thermal mass wall radiated warmth exactly as it had in 1952. The earth-sheltered design continued providing insulation that required minimal heating fuel even during Montana's coldest months. His grandson Michael, age 12, explored the curved interior with fascination. "Grandpa, why is this house built into the hill?" he asked, running his hand along the stone thermal mass wall. Thomas, moving more slowly now, but still sharp in mind and memory, smiled at the question. "Because heat behaves according to predictable principles," he replied. "And because a long time ago I needed to keep your grandmother safe during winter, this design accomplished that goal." Catherine, now 76, sat near the wood stove they still used for primary heating. She had outlived the fear that had defined her early Montana years by 5 decades, but she remembered those years clearly. "Tell them about the November cold snap," she said to Thomas, "the one that changed everything." Thomas settled into his chair and told the story he had recounted hundreds of times over the years. The negative 47-degree temperatures, the family seeking shelter, the validation that his unconventional design actually worked when tested by nature's worst assault. His grandchildren listened with attention that suggested the story remained compelling despite repeated telling. "Did people really make fun of this house?" Michael's sister Sarah asked, looking around the comfortable interior that seemed perfectly normal to her generation. "They called it a tin can buried in dirt," Thomas replied. "They thought I was wasting time and money. They expected me to fail and come begging to learn their traditional methods." "But you didn't fail," Sarah said. "No, the design succeeded because I paid attention to physics rather than tradition. Sometimes the old ways are best, sometimes they're simply old." Outside, snow fell steadily, accumulating on the curved roof and sliding off in periodic small avalanches. The exterior temperature hovered around 20 degrees. Inside, the thermometer read 67 degrees, maintained with a modest fire that burned less than 1 log per hour. The structure performed exactly as Thomas's calculations had predicted 5 decades earlier. Michael walked to the window, watching snow fall across the valley. "Are there more houses like this one now?" he asked. "Hundreds," Thomas replied him, "maybe thousands across Montana, Wyoming, and Canada. People took the principles I developed and adapted them to their specific needs. Some built complete earth-sheltered structures like this one. Others incorporated thermal mass or improved insulation into traditional designs. The exact form doesn't matter. What matters is that people learned to build more efficiently." Catherine stood and moved to stand beside Thomas, placing her hand on his shoulder. "What your grandfather built here wasn't just a house," she told the grandchildren. "It was proof that one person paying careful attention to a problem can develop solutions that help entire communities. He saved my life. Then he saved dozens of other lives by sharing what he learned. Thomas covered her hand with his own, remembering the terrified woman he had carried through -40-degree cold on their first Montana winter, the woman who had trusted him enough to let him spend 3 months building an experimental structure that everyone said would fail, the woman who had stood beside him for 56 years through every challenge frontier life could offer. "The structure kept us warm," Thomas said quietly. "But Catherine kept me human. Engineering solves technical problems. Love solves everything else." That evening, after the grandchildren had gone to bed in the loft space Thomas had added years earlier, he and Catherine sat together near the thermal mass wall, feeling its familiar radiant warmth. Outside, temperature dropped to 15 degrees. Inside, comfort maintained itself with minimal effort, exactly as it had for over half a century. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked. "The years of struggle, the mockery, the risk that your design might have failed?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I regret the fear I put you through that first winter. I regret not understanding sooner that traditional methods had limitations, but I don't regret building this structure or sharing what I learned. How many families stayed warm because they adopted these principles? How many lives were saved?" "We'll never know the exact number," Catherine replied. "No," Thomas agreed, "but we know it's more than 0. That's sufficient." The fire burned low, coals glowing red in the darkness. The thermal mass wall continued its silent work, storing and releasing heat in the endless cycle that had sustained them through 52 Montana winters. Outside, snow accumulated and wind whispered across the valley. Inside, warmth held, steady, maintained not by desperate effort, but by careful attention to how heat actually behaves in the real world. Thomas Brennan's impossible innovation had become routine, proof that what seems revolutionary becomes ordinary once people understand it works. His buried tin can, mocked and dismissed, had survived longer than most traditionally built cabins, outlasted the skeptics who doubted it, and demonstrated that wisdom sometimes comes not from following established paths, but from asking whether those paths actually lead where we need to go. The curved ceiling rose overhead in the darkness, and Thomas closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that he had built something that would outlast him, something that had protected those he loved and taught others they could build protection for themselves. The warmth surrounded him, earned through knowledge and sustained by physics, exactly as reliable as the day he calculated it should be.